Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and today we're going to be talking about disability. The 1950s and 60s saw the civil rights movement. The women's liberation movement spanned the 1960s through 80s, and the gay rights movement began long before Stonewall, but gained traction there and made meaningful progress across the 1970s. The existence of trans people became significantly more public last decade, and we are still in the midst of the push for their rights to be protected as much as any other American. I believe that disability is the final frontier of equal rights movements, and that COVID is bringing this conversation to the forefront, even while many actively ignore or deny its impact. The reality is, COVID is unlike anything we've ever seen before. Everyone experiences COVID infections differently, but no one is unaffected. I was very healthy prior to my first COVID infection in January of 2022, but it caused me to have inflammation around my heart. My resting heart rate is still in the 60s and 70s, but it will shoot up to 145 beats per minute just from something as simple as putting on my shoes. I then got COVID 3 more times this year in a 3-month period, and I have a lot of anxiety about it because I hear about a lot of people dying from heart attacks and strokes. Anytime I feel my heart flutter or some pain in my chest, I wonder if I'm about to end up in the hospital or die. I am still able to exercise, but I have to monitor my heart rate closely, go slower, and take more breaks than I did before because my heart has still not recovered to where it was pre-COVID. I've done a decent amount of research on how to manage long COVID, and it seems like one of the primary determinants of whether someone gets long COVID is whether a person is able to get sufficient rest after an infection. As busy as I am grateful that I'm able to have leisure time in my schedule and go at a pace that doesn't put me at increased risk. Some estimates say that it can take up to 12 weeks after an infection for the inflammation around the heart to subside, and a lot of people lead lives in which they are required to get back to work at full capacity, and they suffer the consequences. A friend of mine recently told me that a coworker of hers had back-to-back COVID infections and had a heart attack because of the immense stress from his job and because he was denied sick leave when asked for it after finding out that he had COVID. In spite of the damage that it causes to us, capitalism only cares about a company's bottom line, and we are expected to literally sacrifice ourselves so that the rich can keep getting richer. Some researchers have called COVID airborne AIDS and have referred to it as a mass disabling event because of its far-reaching impacts and how many people are affected by it. As I said, each of us will have different side effects of repeated infections, with some losing their tolerance to alcohol, some losing their tolerance to caffeine, others becoming heat intolerant, some others experiencing brain damage, and still others experiencing mobility issues. And then, of course, there are the people who have heart attacks and strokes, both of which can lead to long-term impairment if they don't kill you. It's too early to tell if everyone who gets COVID experiences this, but the reason it's referred to as airborne AIDS is because it also has the ability to attack a person's T cells, which are one of the first lines of defense in our immune system. It's not that people necessarily die directly of AIDS, but because their T cell count was so low that even a cold could take them out. So it's definitely worrisome that COVID can also affect us this way. I say all of this not to scare you, but to point out how much we've been asked to move past COVID and overlook the ways our government doesn't care about us, all for the sake of capital. People will always matter more than money, in my worldview, But capitalism is like Lord Farquaad in the first Shrek movie, where he says, "Some of you will die, but that is a risk I am willing to take." Capitalism is to blame for much of ableism. It ties our value to our productivity, and since many people with disabilities may not be as effective as able-bodied, neurotypical workers, they are deemed less valuable. There's even a term that I learned about in my first semester of my PhD that is a fucked up concept, but important for us to be aware of. Necropolitics is the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die. In other words, it's the discussion of which lives are seen as worth saving. AIDS was ignored by the Reagan administration because it primarily affected gay men and black women, populations that the government already saw as less deserving of life, so it didn't intervene because it was killing people they saw as undesirable. Early on in COVID, once we learned that people of color were disproportionately affected, many white people became more lax with safety measures like masking and social distancing. COVID highlighted long-standing inequalities in our country, such that people of color and the poor were most heavily impacted and seen as least deserving of protection by our government. Those who already had underlying health conditions, especially the immunocompromised, were viewed as expendable because the systems of oppression that we live under assign less value to their lives. I'll admit, the realities of COVID are often overwhelming and inconvenient. It's scary to think that anytime we go outside or have a friend over, we are putting ourselves and others at risk. Many people who pushed back against the COVID lockdowns argued that we need social interaction. They aren't wrong, but many acted as though the risks of lockdown were greater than the risks of COVID spreading freely. We were told it would just take 2 weeks to flatten the curve if everyone got on board with quarantining, and, unfortunately, we saw that a lot of people were unwilling to put the needs of the collective over their own. A lot of people like to now refer to COVID in past tense terms. They'll say, "back in COVID," as though it's not still running rampant and infecting, impairing, and killing thousands each week. Many people are choosing to dig their heels in and say that these deaths aren't COVID-related, because hospitals and public health agencies may not be counting them as such, but that is only because of government mandates to stop collecting COVID data. In September 2022, President Joe Biden said that the pandemic is over, and a lot of people were all too willing to believe that this is truly the case, rather than accept the harder truth that our government cares more about capital than it does about its citizens. In fact, some places, such as Nassau County, New York, have criminalized masking in public, a behavior that harms no one and further illustrates that our government is neither on our side nor even moral. I live in New York now, and I mask when I go in stores or ride public transportation, and I know that I could be masking more consistently, but I definitely hate the idea that I could be told that I'm not allowed to mask at all. I saw a tweet recently that said something like, "If you feel upset when you see people wearing masks in public, it's because you know it's the right thing to do." So far, no one has said anything to me about masking, but I do occasionally get looks from people who may feel that I'm overreacting. They are entitled to their opinion, just as I am entitled to do what I feel I need to do to protect myself and others. One of the traps of colonialism is all or nothing thinking, and I think that a lot of people have completely moved away from wearing masks because they think that if they're not wearing it all the time, there's no point in even wearing it some of the time. A lot of public health measures are focused on risk mitigation, which acknowledges that some effort is better than none. In a perfect world, COVID wouldn't be a thing at all, and in the next best world, everyone would mask consistently. We don't live in either of those worlds, but risk mitigation, like herd immunity, would do a lot to lower the transmission of COVID. If everyone in New York were to wear a mask on the subway, I imagine the spread would go down significantly. If everyone were also to wear masks at the airport, on planes, and anytime they were in a store, we would see a significant decrease in transmission. As we'll see more in the next episode, this country's hyper-focus on the individual at the expense of the collective contributes to why COVID is now endemic, but I don't want to simply blame individuals and not acknowledge that our government does have a responsibility to protect us and that they have absolutely failed us in that regard. There's another tweet that I saw that said it makes no sense for people to disregard disability since everyone will become disabled in some way if they live long enough. You might eventually go blind, or have hearing loss, or have mobility issues, perhaps as a result of an injury or accident. Or else you might develop a health condition. And, if and when that happens, you will want accommodation, which may involve behavior modification by others to protect you. And, to be clear, you will absolutely deserve to be accommodated. But as it stands, our society fails those with disabilities. We are not taught to consider our society's most vulnerable, and in fact, are often taught to blame them for their circumstances. The terms invisible illness or hidden disability refer to conditions, be they mental, physical, or neurological, that affect a person's functioning, but you can't tell they have it just by looking at them. Examples include HIV, autism, Crohn's disease, sickle cell anemia, lupus, anxiety, ADHD, MS, sensory processing disorders, dyslexia, and still many more. Some disabilities, or at least side effects of hidden disabilities, are more visible, and yet our society more frequently assigns blame than it extends compassion. MS, or multiple sclerosis, is a condition in which a person's neurons are attacked by their immune system, and people who are more heavily impacted by it may experience significant pain and challenges with mobility, which can lead to weight gain. Obesity is also pathologized in our society and is often seen as a reflection of a person's character. We think they're fat because they're lazy. The fact is, you don't know anything about someone or their health history just by looking at them, and yet we routinely behave as though we do know someone's circumstances. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I think the idea that we could all be more compassionate sums up the rest of what I want to share about this. Neurodivergence is another type of hidden disability and includes autism and ADHD. I am neurodivergent, and I have learned to navigate this world well, but it is often a challenge for me because we are all held to neurotypical expectations, and not all of us can meet those expectations. When I was in undergrad, I was able to receive accommodations for my disability, and now that I am self-employed, I am able to structure my schedule in ways that work with how my brain works. But many people do not have the flexibility and freedom that I do. Neurodivergence is a term used to describe someone's brain when it processes, learns, and/or behaves differently from what is considered typical. Despite the challenges, there are also many great things that can come from neurodivergence, such as increased creativity and new perspectives. It isn't truly that being neurodivergent is a problem, so much as it is the attitude that we should all meet neurotypical expectations. There's a lot of crossover of people with autism spectrum disorders and other forms of neurodivergence and LGBTQ identities. It's speculated that because neurodivergent people do not adhere to social norms that don't make sense to them, they are more able to be honest with themselves about their attraction and/or gender identity. Researchers and some of the general public have noted that so many people came out in COVID, and this is because, while quarantining, people realized that when they weren't performing gender the way they were expected, they didn't even want to perform that gender. It didn't fit. Switching tracks here, I want to take a moment to share a brief personal story about how my perspective on disability was shaped. I had an aunt who was born with extreme mental and physical handicaps, and she needed multiple surgeries from the moment she was born, and even then, doctors told my grandparents that she was unlikely to live even a week. When she survived that first week, the prognosis was that she might not last 2 weeks, then a month, then 4 months, and so on. She lived to be 42, and across her life, she had countless hospitalizations, surgeries, medical professionals on hand to help her, and other support staff. A lot of her immediate family expended a lot of effort to take care of her, and I couldn't even guess at how much taxpayer money funded her care. She needed a walker from the time she was about 10 years old and was permanently in a wheelchair by the time she was 20. Because of her cognitive impairments, she had very limited capacity to work, but I know that she did some sort of work a few hours a week for some period of her life. I think something like stuffing envelopes for local offices. Because of how little value she could add to a company, coupled with how much money it cost to keep her alive, capitalism would make the argument that her life was not worth what she cost. In spite of her limitations and many hospitalizations, she was a very happy person. She would regularly call her siblings and ask about their lives, and she always had a good attitude about the hand life dealt her. If you've never known a person like her, it's easier to believe that some people are more trouble than they're worth. But I'm grateful to have grown up with her in my life because she proves that all human life has value, regardless of their ability to add to a company's bottom line. Lastly, I want to point out how much ableist language we use on a daily basis without recognizing it. In one of my class discussions, someone said that they were previously blind to this issue and were glad that their eyes were opened to it, and another classmate pointed out that this is ableist language and they should be mindful of phrasing their newfound awareness differently. I recalled this instance recently when I was recording a different episode and almost said that I was worried my message would fall on deaf ears. I then remembered a class I took almost a decade ago that focused on disability and the importance of person-first language, where typically we might describe someone as autistic or wheelchair-bound or talk about homeless people. Person-first language asks of us exactly what it sounds like. Describe the person before their disability so as not to define them by it. Instead of autistic person, we have person with autism. Instead of wheelchair-bound, say a person who uses a wheelchair. And instead of calling them homeless, we'd say people experiencing homelessness. Like with pronouns, some people like to make a big deal out of these shifts and say that we're too focused on political correctness and too much is being asked of them. It is a shift, but there's just no excuse for being an asshole. I don't care if it takes an extra second. Do it because it's the right thing to do. All people are deserving of respect, and people with disabilities or other similar circumstances are no less deserving than anyone else. Until next time, I'm Jake Ryan, and this has been Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.